Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. So, my name is Dr. Mike Barnes. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at a treatment center in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Anyone ever been to Steamboat? It's a pretty awesome place. Yeah, pretty fortunate. Um, so, I guess I'm supposed to go through. I don't have anything to disclose. We'll go through this. So, I always start this presentation with a question. Has anyone in this room ever worked with an unmotivated client? Yeah, we've all worked with unmotivated clients. Or have we? So when I was a professor at the University of Colorado, I had a student who asked me once, so can you give us some pointers in working with an unmotivated client? And I thought about it, and I said, I don't think I have any pointers because I don't think I've ever worked with an unmotivated client. I work with a lot of clients who are pretty motivated to stay the same. And so why did I say that? Number one, she was setting up this sort of artificial dichotomy. Motivated is good, unmotivated is bad. So I wanted to deal with that immediately. But what I was really thinking is that if I'm a traumatized client, and I work with trauma, I've been working with trauma since the early 90s, that I'm highly motivated to stay safe. And so when I think about this thing working, that if I'm traumatized, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm highly motivated to stay safe. And sometimes that's really dangerous. And sometimes that means I engage in really avoidant behavior. And sometimes that means that I engage in dangerous behavior in order to try to stay safe. But if you look at the things that Maslow kind of identified as higher order needs, friendship, family, sexual intimacy, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, morality, creativity. Those are the things that our clients struggle with the most. And so when I left academics and went to Cedar is the treatment center at the University of Colorado Hospital, I really set out in my mind to move beyond trauma-informed care to trauma-integrated care. I'm like, what does that really mean? Like, how do we actually do that? So this is sort of a story about that progression. And it starts with the idea that, unfortunately, many of my clients are hardwired to stay the same. Half the speakers at this conference are going to talk to you about neuroscience and all of those things. But we need to start figuring out how to put that into place, how to use that clinically and therapeutically. So I will talk about doing that. Let's get back. So the first thing that we did when we were trying to develop this integrated model was to develop our own kind of continuum of what we thought trauma was. And so often trauma in addiction treatment is actually this process of trying to kind of get the person sober enough to work on the trauma. And if you think about developmental models of trauma, you begin to look at different kinds of trauma, you realize that it's often the trauma that keeps the person from getting sober. And so the brain doesn't know the difference between threat that is shame-based due to something I've done with my addiction than it does with the threat of some other thing. So we started to look at how do we put those pieces together. And so we look at it on one end of the continuum as big T trauma, that idea of a major traumatic event. We spend far more time dealing with developmental trauma. And so that's where our integrated model moves from the idea that we can treat big T trauma once the safety issues have been addressed and the person has begun to establish coping skills, autonomic nervous system, managing the reactivation. And then I'm a big proponent that we have a pretty significant problem in this country with societal trauma. And so that even clients who don't come in with a big T event or did not grow up in a family with generations of addiction, that just living in our society today, CNN syndrome, Fox News, all of the things that are happening, the shootings that happen on a daily basis in this country, that it does impact people's autonomic nervous system. And so that if we're going to really treat it, we have to use trauma-informed care as a universal precaution. We assume everyone has it when they come into our treatment center. So we're not treating only traumatized individuals with addiction. All of our clients are getting a model in which they're learning the same basic coping skills that they will need, whether it's to deal with their addiction or to deal with their trauma. Now, and I'll talk about those models. And so when I talk about societal trauma, there's a book that was written, a lot of my references are kind of older because they came from when I was first developing my thoughts about it. But I don't know, has anyone in this room ever read a book called Shattered Assumptions? It was a book about cognitive therapy for trauma back in the 90s. And it was written by a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And she said that the primary schemas in the United States culture associated with safety are that the world is benevolent, the world is meaningful, and that the world is worthy. And benevolent means that it's generally safe to be in the world. People are kind of kind and generous and safe. Meaningfulness means if I'm really responsible, I should be able to manage my own safety perspectives in my world. And the last one is the self is worthy. How many have been in the field long enough to remember when the book, When Good Things Happen to Bad People, or When Bad Things Happen to Good People, sorry about that. Yeah, like we used to give everyone that book. That was like such a big part of it. And the reality is that book is still as valid today as it was 20 years ago. And I think we need to go back to that. But if Janoff Bowman is correct, and I think she is, if we have trauma, then the world ceases to be benevolent and starts to be dangerous. And it ceases to be meaningful, and it starts to be random. And it ceases that good things happen to good people, and it starts to be that even the best people get traumatized. And she believed that it was really the beginning, rather than looking at the neuroscience of it, she looked at that as the beginning of a need to be in control and to be hypervigilant in every aspect of our lives. And in my practice, that's what I see our clients walk in with. They want to get sober, the vast majority. Some are doing whatever they can do to comply. But for the ones who really want to get sober, it is this shift from safety to the environment being dangerous that makes addiction treatment so important. And if we're going to be trauma integrated, we have to first be trauma informed. And we'll talk about what that means. But it's really critical that it's not just a model of care. It's an environment. Your techs have to be as trauma integrated and trauma educated and trauma aware as your therapists. Who spends far more time with your clients than your techs? And so what you will see in our model is that it's not just a clinical model. It's a model of from the moment someone hits our ranch, that it becomes a safe space. So I just include these statistics because we tend not to think about this. But this is a slide of what happens in one day in the United States every day. 43 people are murdered, 2,200 are raped or experience rape. I think that's much higher. 123 commit suicide, 128 die from opiate overdose, 240 die from alcohol-related death. So if you ask clients, how many of you have asked clients if they've ever had a major trauma in their lives, and they said no, and then when you say to them, has anyone in your family ever had cancer? And they go, oh yeah, my mom had cancer when I was a kid, or I had cancer when I was a kid. I want you to be like really kind of broadening your scope. That's one of the things I ask every client that we have. Have you ever had like any kind of major life-threatening medical condition? Because who's going to be traumatized when a kid has cancer? His parents are going to be traumatized. And so does that trauma of the family then impact how that child's psychological well-being, attachment is developed? We're going to talk about family programs. And family programs are even more important to be trauma integrated. And not the trauma of the client, the trauma of the family. We'll talk about that. Multiple shootings. So, 4,000 people, almost 5, will be diagnosed with cancer every day in the United States. 1,600 will die from cancer. And so we begin to look at the number of family members. And so when we look at these statistics, shootings, church shootings, cyberbullying, If you've read the research on bullying, you will see that it is more damaging to the child's developing brain than actually physical assault. So a child who is consistently bullied, whether it is at home by an abusive parent or whether it's by a traumatized sibling, whether it's by a kid in the neighborhood, that's a big part of our assessment. It's not just those typical traumas that we tend to think about, but issues of bullying, relationship and family bullying is critical. Gender issues, racism. So this is, I tell you this to build the foundation for societal trauma. And so that everyone that we treat has experienced some degree of that. So developmental trauma, and so I just wanted to say that if we believe that we live in a potentially traumatizing society, then this issue of misattunement of needs from caregiver to child, chronic early abuse, neglect, poor attachment, childhood shock traumas, big T events, parasympathetic freeze, sympathetic fight or flight, that if we live in a traumatized society, we're going to have those same trauma symptoms. They may be less pervasive than a big T event, but they're going to impact what we do in our treatment with the basic addiction. Dually activated autonomic nervous system. So I'll be really honest with you, we do very little with big T trauma anymore. If we can keep someone for 90 days, we may actually start opening the door to some of that. The vast majority of everything we do is dealing with developmental trauma, because it's actually at the foundation. When I was in private practice, if someone came to my office with a big T event, we could resolve that pretty quickly. Because what I would say to them is, particularly if it was an adult trauma, do you remember a time when you were safe? And they'll say, yeah, I do, but I don't feel safe anymore. Get someone coming in with a developmental trauma, and it's like, I've never been really safe a day in my life. So it's the difference between rehabilitation and habilitation from that safety perspective. So that's what I think trauma-integrated work actually is that foundation of beginning to understand the autonomic nervous system and the wiring process that keeps that person stuck in the same behaviors that they've always been in. So this slide may seem simple, and the idea that we've kind of moved into this sort of trauma or into this gender separate treatment. When I got to the Foundry, we were treating men and women together. And when I began to really look at the level of trauma work that I wanted to do, it was very clear that we could not do that. And so we ceased our women's program, we stopped it, and we only treat men at this point. And when we look at the history from kind of basic treatment where everyone was in the kind of being treated together back into the 70s and 80s, where we began to look at gender issues, but we kept them in the same space, but we treated them slightly different. We understood, particularly with the women's movement, the issue of trauma in women. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, we began to develop separate programs. That when I say gender responsive treatment, I really think about like gender socialization of men and addiction. And so we work with Dan Griffin's, his workbooks. We do 2 groups a day or 2 groups a week on that issue. It is a daily discussion about how our clients have been socialized into looking at issues from the man rules. Don't be weak, don't show emotion, don't cry, and looking at the issues of recovery. That is a lens through which our treatment team looks every single day to begin to realize that if the statistics are accurate, that twice as many women will get post-traumatic stress disorder than men, which they do, and men have actually more traumatic events. And that idea of what role does gender socialization play in how a man presents at treatment, or how a woman presents at treatment. And so that issue of just treating them separately is kind of insufficient for a truly trauma-integrated model. It's really understanding the role of gender socialization, how it keeps them stuck, and how it keeps them from showing up in treatment. And that's a picture of my son and my grandson, and I always comment about him rocking those dinosaur pajamas. They're pretty cool. But I show that picture to our clients to say, if you look at me, the grandfather, and my son and my grandson, that idea of how from generation to generation it begins to get past these rules, these laws of how we're going to be as men get passed through. And it really opens the door to see this really interesting discussion. And so trauma integrated work isn't just treating men and women separately. It's how are we going to treat men and women from a truly understanding their traumas, but also how gender socialization promotes them showing up in treatment. Our interventions are going to be really different. So traumatized families. So you've probably heard someone show up at your treatment center and bring you a client and they've said, I just brought you the healthiest member of this family. Anyone ever hear someone say that? Interventionists say that to me all the time. And that idea that, so my research has been on traumatized families, particularly after catastrophic injuries or illnesses to children. And I'm going to show you a slide of the findings of my research, but so often family programs are about enabling. They're about codependency. If you look at the definition of codependency and you look at the definition of developmental trauma side by side, they are identical. And so if we're still talking in those terms, rather than the terms of developmental trauma, we miss the opportunity for family healing to begin to happen. And so often, that idea of, so I wrote an article in Addiction Professional magazine a couple years ago, and the lead into the article was how many families say to us, I wish my loved one would get sober so that we could get back to normal. And that idea that normal sailed a long time ago, like that original normal that they think they're going back to, and that they've created this new normal. And the new normal is how are we going to live with this person in this state of crisis and chaos all the time? And so if we assume that that family's trauma is simply kind of that mobile where they're adjusting to the person's addiction, we miss this incredible opportunity to help this family heal. Because if the numbers are as clear as they are for individuals who come into treatment who have trauma and addiction, what do you think the numbers for family members are? What about that mom who grew up with an alcoholic father and has been enabling since she was 5 years old? I always say that telling a client, a parent or a family member to stop enabling is like Nancy Reagan telling an addict to say no. It's absurd. Unless you're going to teach them how to do that. Talk to any family member who has been told to stop enabling and their loved one walks in the front door, it's the end of the month, they're walking up the hall, you know they're going to ask you for money, you know you're supposed to say no, and you ask them to begin to talk about their somatic experience in that moment while that person's walking up the hall. My heart starts to pound. My chest gets tight. My throat starts to close. I can barely talk. I try to say no, but he starts to posture. I get scared. I say yes. He leaves. I feel guilty and ashamed. That's a trauma response. That's not just learned behavior. That's a sympathetic nervous system response to threat. And so the threat of what if I don't do that and he dies? I've heard family members say that 1,000 times. But that idea of how do we help them begin to recognize that how I respond to this is going to play a very large role in how this person's recovery happens or doesn't happen. And so this movement from, so when I was at Cedar, we did a research project, and in that project we asked the families a lot of questions, but one of them was living with an actively using family member is traumatizing. And 93% said absolutely, 5% said they agreed, so 97% of everyone saw it as such. But if we stop at that point, we miss the opportunity to say, what traumas have you had in your life that might be influencing that? And so it's always interesting when a client says to me, well, it's not a family disease because neither of my parents have alcoholism or addiction. And I always say, so which one of your grandparents has? And they go, oh, my mom's dad was an alcoholic. Yeah, do you think that might have had an impact in how that family organizes? And in family therapy, we talk about the rules and the roles and the routines and rituals that the family organizes around in order to kind of meet their goals. And how are those influenced by addiction and past generations? And so if you're going to really do trauma integrated work, your family program has to be trauma integrated and not trauma informed, but have the courage to begin to talk to family members about their traumas, and not just the trauma of living with this person who's out of control, but their traumas in their own childhoods. So does that make sense? How, like, that, the importance of that? And so when we look at this mobile, if I were to ask a family member, how long does it take for you to identify that your loved one is intoxicated when they walk in the front door? What do you think the answer to that is? Yeah, the average answer, and I've asked hundreds of families, is 2 seconds. So that sounds pretty hypervigilant to me. And I asked them, so do you have a button on the side of your house that you press when they're intoxicated that tells everyone in the family to initiate the intoxication protocol? And they look at me like I'm a smart ass and say, well, of course not. I said, then how do people in your family know? And they say, they just know. And that organization of how these individuals interact when this identified patient walks in the house is different if they're intoxicated than if they're sober. And so when you look at the symptoms that this family is dealing with on a daily basis, intoxication, hyperarousal, anxiety, thoughts, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, dissociation, depression, conflict, medical issues, legal issues, you begin to see how the new normal begins to happen the longer the person's addiction. How many of you thought when I read those that I was talking about the client? I'm talking about the family. Family members have the exact same symptoms. Ask any family member, are there times where you're sitting at your computer and you're supposed to be working, but you just can't get your loved one out of your mind? I said, every day. Do you worry about whether they took their medicine? Every day. Do you worry about whether they got to their meeting? Every day. And so what's one of those primary trauma symptoms of intrusive thoughts? How many of you have sleep disturbances? Every night. And so that idea of, I always start with the trauma of their loved one because they're really interested in helping their loved one, and then begin to slowly slide it around to their own trauma in a way that makes it palatable, A, but B, it's both educational and it's informative, and it allows for the shift to happen. So these are the, so I have a son, he's now 33 years old. He lives in Tampa, and he was hit by a car when he was 5. And he broke his femur in half and split his liver almost in half and split a kidney in half and hit his head on the front of the car. And anyone in here familiar with red ants in Florida? He landed on a red ant pile. And so it was at night. And so people didn't immediately notice that. And what's the one thing you don't do with someone who's injured to that degree? You don't ever move them. So he laid on an ant pile for about 30 minutes. So it gives you an image of that. It's pretty graphic. The last part always gets people. It's the ants that get people. And so my wife was standing right from here to that wall from him. So think about the DSM-5 criteria for traumatic events. It talks about people who have experienced an event, people who have witnessed an event, people who have learned about the events of a loved one. So in our family at that time, our son met the first one. He experienced it. His mom witnessed it. And then I learned about it and had to deal with it. Do you think we were all traumatized? We were all very clearly traumatized. So my son not too long ago said to me, tell me the story of the accident where I got hit by the car. Think about that. And I said, do you not remember it? And he said, I really don't. Do you think I remember it? I remember every detail of it. That's that difference between being a 5-year-old kid who got traumatized. So that idea that just because the kid gets traumatized doesn't mean that the parents don't, or the family members, partners, actually don't have far more significant traumatic stress that has to be dealt with. And so we need to educate that process. So these are the things that we found in our study. First one, family members frequently experience the same symptoms of traumatic stress as the client. So if you'll kind of tolerate me going back and forth. I did a study where I studied family members of individuals with chronic mental health issues, addiction. I never used the word trauma in the study, But I asked them what it was like if someone were to call you and say, our loved one was just diagnosed with the same things that your loved one was, what would we expect to have happen in our lives? And I had 40 hours of transcripts, and when I transcribed them, these were the things that the family said consistently across the board. Common feelings: anger, fear, grief, guilt, horror, at times terror. This doesn't happen to our family. This happens, we read about this in the news. And that was one of the first thought I had when they told me that he got hit. This doesn't happen to families like us. This is unbelievable that this could possibly happen to us. This lack of reality, anxiety, depression, frustration, and shame, the exact same feelings that our clients feel on a regular basis. Common defense mechanisms: denial, rationalization, intellectualization, the exact same defenses that our clients use. But yet we're going to talk to that family and educate them as if they don't have those exact same issues. And you can begin to see how that kind of sets the family into crisis. Common cognitions: intrusive thoughts, fear of the future, hopelessness, helplessness. And they talk about this, the telephone ringing at 11 o'clock and the immediate terror. Common physical symptoms: sleeplessness, exhaustion, nightmares. The exact same thing that any traumatized individual has. And then hypervigilance, control, triggers, startle response. And so without ever using the word trauma, what they told me was, you're going to have a trauma response. You're going to be traumatized by this experience. Yeah. So if you're kind of standing there and a horn goes off or a backfire and you kind of jump and... So does that, like, this was just family, this was never even talked about as being trauma. This is just like, what's it like if someone were to call and say, tell me what it's like, what are we going to be dealing with my son? And so it is pretty pervasive process. The second one is that the longer the family is unable to resolve the trauma, the longer they remain in consistent sympathetic and parasympathetic reactivity, state of fight, flight, and freeze, the less solution-focused they become and the more survival-focused they become. Anyone in here ever heard like family therapists talk about being organized around a problem? And that idea that very early on when the problem happens, I'll show you a slide of a model that explains this, we're very solution-focused. We try everything we can think. Over the course of time, we become more and more survival-focused. How are we going to keep this guy from dying? How are we going to keep this family from breaking apart? And that begins to play out in enabling overprotection, hypervigilance, and control. Those are not just learned patterns, those are survival patterns for most families. The third one is family members' perceptions about the nature, course, or implications of the problem are far more important than the reality. And I want you to think about that. Reality means very little to that family. Their perception means everything. And so a lot of times families will say to me, what do you think we should do? And I used to tell them. And then I'd realize that none of them ever did it. And so now I ask them a simple question. If I tell you, will you do it? What do you think the most common answer is? They almost never say no. I mean, that would be way too weird. And they very frequently say, yeah, we're that desperate that you tell us we'll do it. The vast majority is, well, it depends on what you tell us. And so what they're really saying is, it depends on whether what you tell us meets our perception of the problem to do. And so I don't know if any of you have ever read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. And it's a business book. It's not a therapy book. But what he says is that like executives around the country's bookshelves are filled with business books that tell them what they should do and how to do it. And the vast majority of people never do any of it because they miss the most important question, which is, why should we do it? And so if we're going to be working with traumatized families, our first thing is we want to give them resources. Go to Al-Anon, go see this therapist, go do this. And if it doesn't fit how they view themselves and their problem, they're not going to do any of that. And so our family programs need to focus much more on why and getting people to begin to look at themselves and their own histories and their own reactions and what's it like for you when your son or daughter, husband, wife, whatever, comes in with that issue. And then the last one is family systems experience what I called in my dissertation, systemic traumatic stress disorder. The idea of everyone walking into the house and looking at each other and reacting based on how other people. When I was a kid, I used to walk out of my bedroom and the first thing I would do is look to find my mom and see how she was doing. If she was okay, then I could go do what I wanted to do. If she wasn't, then I had to do something to take care of her. Now, that's caring, but it's also a kid who's saying, whose needs are more important? That's the foundation of developmental trauma. And so that idea of how do we begin to get people to look at that impact throughout the system. And so this is there's a model called the double ABCX model. My PhD is in family therapy, so it's one of those models that I always use to kind of understand where families are in their kind of organization at any given time. And if you look at this slide, this is the beginning. So double ABX means there's two different ABXs, obviously. And so here's the stressor or the event. It could be developmental, addiction, trauma, other kinds of illness, heart attack, those kinds of things. It's an interesting study. One of my doctoral students did his dissertation on the wives of men who had heart attacks. Who do you think has more PTSD? The guy who has the heart attack and almost dies, or the wife? The wife, by far. When we talked to the wives, we said, why do you think that is? And what they told us was, well, he was unconscious for most of this. I was the one sitting at the bedside getting the play-by-play of how dangerous it was. And then they told us the most important thing. You know, he's never going to change. He doesn't eat right. He doesn't exercise. He's a workaholic. He's going to die. What do our families tell us? He won't go to meetings. He won't. It's the same powerlessness. So we talk about trauma as a powerlessness issue. It's actually even more of a powerless issue for families who are trying to get someone else to change. And so we want to give them resources so they can go through change and solve it. And again, this is that perception issue. And perception is kind of defined or kind of influenced by family history, personal trauma history, adverse childhood events, those kinds of things. And so the last slide that I'm going to show is what I think are the steps to a trauma-integrated thing, and 3-generation assessment is pretty critical. Now, you can't always get a good one, meaning people don't know, but if you can, that opens the door to figure out where that issue of perception comes from. Because this is the second part of that model, that if they don't resolve it here, they go into crisis, the addiction continues, the trauma continues, and now rather than just addiction, now they have legal problems, financial problems, relational problems, financial problems, every other kind of problem known to mankind that is now a pile-up. That means that it's going to prevent them from actually resolving these issues. So these are the clients we tend to get, not these clients. And so I was involved in a research project where we studied this model, and what we found is the earlier we can get a client or a family, the more hierarchical they want us to be. They want us to tell them what to do. The longer they've been in the system, the more treatment centers they've gone to, what they really want is a collaborator, someone to partner with them. And so for that family, I would never say, here's what I think you should do. For that family, I would say, how do you understand it? Like, why do you think it keeps going this way? And it just creates a very different environment. So this is, again, I don't want to spend too much time on family, but this is the best example I've ever seen for the idea of a systemic traumatic stress. That an event happens, and it impacts everyone in the family. The parents, the children, grandparents, extended family, neighbors, and it impacts the relationships that they have with each other. It impacts the kids, siblings relationships, parent-child relationships, parenting practices. So I will tell you that there was a time where my son was young, and he was probably 7. He got hit when he was 5. And his mom, my first wife, said, do me a favor, go get the newspaper. And he got hit right in front of the newspaper box. And Patrick said, I'll get it. And my wife went, no, 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 no. And he looked at her and went, what do you think I'm going to do, run out in front of another car? And I looked at her and I said, he's the healthiest person in this house. that we're walking around praying that he's okay so we can be okay. And it impacted our parenting. It impacted our relationships with him. And we had very different relationships with him. There's a concept in social psychology called the fadeaway father. And the idea that after traumas of this nature, oftentimes a mother will become closer to the son or daughter, whoever was traumatized, in a caretaker role. And that the other partner will begin to feel alienated or disconnected from that role. And the term that we use is a bystander. That person and the assumption is he doesn't care. But the reality is he cares a lot, but he feels really hurt that he is no longer able to have a say or a part in that. So it's important to begin to look at who are the enablers, who are the ones that are enmeshed, who are the ones that are disconnected. Does that make sense? That I don't want to beat this to death, but I want you to get to see that our family programs are probably the most important program, equally as important as our other parts. And then obviously epigenetics and the idea of transgenerational trauma and understanding that issue that we've really studied. We have some pretty good studies on transgenerational trauma. And the idea that the last one I read a few years ago on Holocaust survivors is they took a study of kids who were 3 generations post-Holocaust and a control group of other Jewish kids who were not 3 generations post-Holocaust. And when they studied how their kind of brains reacted to stress, the kids who have the history of the Holocaust processed stress hormones completely different than the kids who didn't. So that idea of it does go from one generation to the next. The research used to say it went through the sperm, or it went through the egg. Now we realize it goes through the sperm just as equally, that issue of transgeneration. So again, I don't want to take a lot of time with that, but family trauma can be transgenerational as well as personal as well as childhood. Well, and I always show this. This was the first slide. And if we really want to know how they organize around this guy's addiction, just look at 3 generations and how they did it. So that's the slide that I show families, and they get it. And it's like, oh my God, that's exactly what's going on. Okay, the second is trauma-integrated work is actually about us. The vast majority of us have our own trauma histories. And if we haven't done our work, what does that mean to our ability to treat clients in a way where we're not constantly reacting? And so you look at things like compassion fatigue. Who gets compassion fatigue most? Anyone with a trauma history. Whether you've resolved it or not, we still get it higher than anyone else. And also anyone who works with children. So trauma and addiction applies to our own hardwiring. So I started with hardwiring because I want to keep that theme going. If we believe our clients are hardwired to react this way, we have our own trauma history, we're hardwired to act this way. If we haven't done our work, we're going to react the same way they do. And so it's really critical, does your program train your staff on all aspects of trauma? Does your program have compassion fatigue training and compassion fatigue support? Does your program provide employee assistance programs or services to employees who may be struggling with countertransference? Does your program support wellness activities, mindfulness, meditation, all of those things? So that idea of, again, I don't want to spend too much time with this, but that idea of if our treatment environment isn't safe, and that means safe from the ability to use, the ability to be injured, but in my mind, safety is the staff's going to treat me appropriately, and treat me safely. And so we spend a lot of time with training. And we train on, and I'll show you a training slide. So this is a statistic. Brian Bride did this research. I want you to look at these numbers. These are addiction counselors from across the United States. They were all members of NADAC. The study was 2009. But of the people that they studied, 242 people who are actively working in our field, not people who were out of the field because of their struggle, but who were actively working, 43% of all the addiction counselors that they studied reported intrusive thoughts about work. 27 detached estrangement from others, the ability that I don't have the relationships that I used to have. 30% dissociated, emotional numbing. 26% sleep disturbances, 30% irritability. 19% of all of the addiction counselors that they studied had full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we wonder why our turnover is so high in our field. And what does it cost every time you replace anyone in your organization? You have your training costs, you have your certification costs, you have your licensure costs. And so the nursing profession is way ahead of us. They realize that it costs the hospital systems in this country at least $2 to $3 billion a year to deal with compassion fatigue. But boy, they're on it. They identified the term. So that issue of counselors who score high in secondary trauma report lower job satisfaction and lower commitment to their job. They were just members of NADAC, so it could be any level of the organ. Does that make sense, though, that idea of we're walking around with our own significant issues, and how often we've had a client that we say, boy, that guy reminds me just of this person, just someone close to me. The other is this issue of we all grew up in our own families. And if we grew up in families with trauma, then there are saviors, perpetrators, bystanders, and victims within that traumatized family. If we have not come to terms with our own family and how it operates, the role that I played in my family, which vacillated anywhere from bystander to victim in that organization. Clients try to put us in that. Have you ever had a client who say, you only do this for the money? Yes. Which makes me laugh hysterically. Like, oh shit, you have no idea. They're trying to put you in a bystander role. You don't care about me. I've asked you to enable me multiple times and you refuse to do that. And so you must be a bystander because that's the only thing I know how to do. So individuals with avoidant attachment, that's how they operate, right? If you're not going to do what I need you to do, I'm going to abandon you. I'm going to disconnect from you. Well, if I'm that person's therapist, I better have a plan on how I'm going to begin to deal with that avoidant attachment. I'm going to skip through some of this. This is the educational program that we have for our staff. Trauma 101, Trauma Integrated Clinical Model, similar to what we're talking about today. Compassion fatigue. I just finished a big compassion fatigue training, and in that training, I did a survey for all of our staff on sources of burnout. So y'all know, like, compassion fatigue isn't just trauma; it's burnout and secondary trauma. So we did a survey of what are all the sources of burnout in our organization, what are all the sources of secondary trauma in our organization. We put all of that together into a presentation so that we weren't talking about other programs, we were talking about our program, and this is what we're wrestling with. And it's made a pretty significant difference. We have all kinds of exercises that I would be happy to share with you. If you want to incorporate something like this in your organization, I would be happy to share our survey, our various tests. So there's a really good test called the Professional Quality of Life Intervention. It's a short test that gives us a score on secondary trauma, burnout, compassion satisfaction, and it's really very helpful to see where staff is. Patient education, I do 4 lectures for them. I do something every other week. Family education, and then we do a test called the Trauma Symptom Inventory. It's very long, it's 136 questions, but it gives us more information. It so informs our treatment plan, because it talks about depression, anger, intrusive thoughts, defensive avoidance, dissociation. It tells us where the client is in all of those and allows us to wrap services around the safety issues needed to do that within the first week. Mm-hmm. We're in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. I don't know. That's what we were just talking about. I very rarely ever get back here. I'm not sure. So these are just 2 quick stories. So I wrote this article and I said, clients who live consistent lives of inconsistency are consistently concerned about the inconsistencies of others. Like, we all know that guy, right? And so trauma-integrated work means that everyone in that organization understands the rules. And there isn't that one guy who gives us the ability to listen to the radio a certain way and another guy who doesn't. Because the minute we start doing that, it begins to trigger this idea of it's not safe, it's not consistent. The second one is we have two different staff. We have a clinical staff of therapists and then a staff of techs and more CAC level people that manage the house. And how many of you, and I just show of hands, have ever had a conflict between your therapist and how they believe a client's doing and the people who are living with them in the house who see how they're doing? And so we had this one counselor who used to say, after the therapist would give their assessment, and this other person would say, let me tell you what's really going on with this one. And, which isn't great for the therapeutic team. And what she would always say is how bad they were doing in the house. And so we started doing this training with both staff. And is it possible, if I went into a session with a therapist and I have a trauma history, and I began to talk about things that have been the biggest secrets of my life. So what did Claudia Black say the roles of an alcoholic family are? Don't talk, don't feel, and don't trust. And so for the first time in my life, I'm talking to this person about the things that I've always kept secret. Is it possible that when they walk out of that office, they go, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. Now what's going to happen? So what do you think the first thing they're going to do when they get in the house with their peers? Well, that was a terrible session. That was stupid. Yeah, they're going to act out. They're going to war story. And if you understand the neuroscience of war storying, you know that the minute they start talking about using, they're dumping large amounts of dopamine into the system until it believes it's using. And so that idea is they're going to leave that difficult session and act as bad as they have ever acted in that environment. If the two teams are not talking, the therapist goes, that was an awesome session. The team goes, holy cow, that must have been a horrible session. This guy's a wreck. And so if we're going to truly be trauma integrated, we have to have systems. We use a program called Basecamp, where we're sending kind of short notices about how a session went and to notify the house staff, like we would expect this person to act out over the course of this evening. Here's what we would like you to do. And so that's another one of those things that we realize that if we're going to do this level of work, and we have one set of staff thinking someone's doing really good and another set of staff thinking this person's doing really bad, then it's actually going to create a dangerous situation. So I know these seem like little things, but they're not little things. These are really big things in how we communicate. So how many have ever read Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery? Like, if you haven't, to me, that's the book that every trauma therapist should read. And she talks about trauma in a triphasic model of care. And she said the first model of care is safety. The second level is telling the story or mourning and remembrance. And the third level is integrating that person back into society. A trauma-integrated program has to do the exact same thing. We work on safety first. And safety means that we begin to manage hyperarousal, cessation of dangerous coping skills, self-harming, management of intrusive symptoms, reestablishing trust. And this really begins the process of the model that we developed. If we do get someone long enough, then we will work on trauma stories. So, how many of you are familiar with a model in EMDR called DETER? So we use that all the time. And we use that because it allows us to work on addiction-specific triggers and cravings. And so the idea of, I've heard people say, we don't use EMDR until they're ready to work on the trauma. Truly, trauma-integrated work begins to look at, we use brain spotting. Brain spotting has addiction-specific interventions. We use EMDR from the very, I'll do resourcing with a client. I have 2 clients right now, and they've been there for a week, and when I get back, I'm going to start doing EMDR resourcing with them, creating a safe space, creating, those resourcing skills. So that idea of, we have an EMDR therapist, great. When do you use them? How do you use them? When do you not use them? How does that work? And so we have three primary models of care that we do that integrates trauma. We do EMDR, we do brain spotting, and we do somatic. We don't do somatic experiencing. There's a model called CAR that we integrate into our. And so the rest of this presentation is going to really be about that process. So what's the difference between being eclectic and being integrated? So I'll tell you a story. I was in my grad program, and the professor comes in, and he says, we're going to go around the room, and everyone's going to talk about your theoretical orientation. And I immediately thought, well, I'm integrated. I use whatever seems to work and all that. And I was second in line, and the guy in front of me said, I'm eclectic. And the professor said, who do you think you are? You know everything about every model. You can just pick and choose. And I very quickly became cognitive behavioral. I'm not stupid. I knew I could explain that one. And so the difference between being eclectic and being integrated is that integrated models have a core philosophy or a core theoretical model that you build everything else off of. And so it could be 12 steps. It could be any variety of other kinds of models. So this was the original model kind of. I think I was looking back on my old presentations, and the first time I ever did a presentation on trauma-integrated work was like 2013. And I sort of just put that together without having any idea what was the organizing principle, other than I think these are all important. So I'm going to guess that I'm the only person in this room that buys books and then doesn't read them. No. And so, how many of you have had a book that's been sitting on your shelf that haunts you and taunts you and says, read me. I'm the next book that you should read. And so I had this book sitting on my shelf for like 2 years. And it was one of those books where I thought, I should get around to reading that. Like that would be important. And so I was trying to work on an underlying, what is the core model of our program? And I grabbed the book one day and I started reading it and I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what's going to tie all of these other things together in a way that if we can teach our therapists how to do core addiction work while at the same time keeping the environment safe enough, connecting the person to their body, connecting their person to their autonomic nervous system. And I'm sure Dr. Heller and LaPierre would not mind me putting that book up there. So I would say if you really want to look at something that ties it together, and you're going to work in that model right now, buy this book.
Yes.
And they actually have a really good training process as well. And so it's a book that ties somatic psychotherapy, body connection, into the process of being able to work with connecting to others. And so there are 5 core needs. I'll get to the next slide. And so when I was reading it, I thought, wow, what they say is there are these core capacities or 5 core needs that lead to like attachment and health. Connecting to self and others, kind of being in touch with the body, emotions, connection. And when they don't get that, what they get is a disconnect from that. How many of your clients, when you say to them, how do you feel, look at you like a deer in the headlight? I don't know how I feel. I've spent so much time trying not to feel. And so that idea of, and then we send them to 12-step meetings and tell them to embrace the fellowship. When they haven't even connected to themselves, how are they going to connect in the fellowship? And so the idea that we really kind of came to was these 5 things: connection to self and others, attunement to their needs. So if a kid's taking care of their parents' needs all the time, they learn that mine aren't that important. And so now we're saying to them, what do you need? And they go, I've never been allowed to have needs. Trust, trusting yourself first and then trusting others. Autonomy, the ability to live with a boundaried life. And then the last one is love and sex, the idea of, am I worthy of having an intimate relationship? Do I have the ability to be sexual in a healthy way, to be loved in a healthy way? And if you look at it, these are the things that we tend to see in our clients. Difficulty knowing what we need, feeling our needs don't deserve to be met, feeling we can't connect on anyone but ourselves. That avoidant attachment is simply that. I'm the only person I can trust, and I can't even trust myself, to be quite honest. But that idea of I'm sure not trusting everyone around me. And so what this book did was it provided lots of information in each of these areas, and then some pretty specific kind of interventions that you can do to manage those. The other and we'll talk about another part of it in a few minutes, but it really began to look at the difference between pride or shame-based identification and pride-based. And the idea of shame-based being how do each of these issues that we really need to resolve in order to be happy in our lives play themselves out from a shame perspective of a lack of attachment, or a pride-based that says, I don't need anyone, I'm fine, when in reality, they have to be able to work both sides of that. And the idea that really they have to resolve those. And so think about the clients you work with who are simply, if there is such a thing as simply addiction. Where did they go? Did they ever exist? But that idea of, when I read it, I said, we need to be doing this with every single client that we work with, whether they come in with big trauma story or not. And how many of you have ever had a client who went to AA pretty religiously? They had a sponsor. They actually worked the steps. But when it came time to do the fellowship, that they were just so exhausted, they just couldn't do it. Their sponsor would say, hey, we're going out to dinner after the meeting tonight, and there's this person that I want you to meet because you're going to really relate to that person. And it's everything they can do to get home and just get under the covers because they're exhausted. And they relapse because they don't make the calls that they need to make when they're in crisis. So much of what we started to put together was this idea of how does this fit the clients that we work with every day? And so that became the foundation. So when we look back at this, it became that. And so attachment issues, traumatic stress issues are at the foundation. The primary objective is recovery. And in the process of doing that, working on connection, attunement, trust. And so that gave us our kind of window, our operating window of what we were going to start looking at. So if we look at attachment, so you've all probably read stuff by Porges and how that works. But it's really important for us to, so I started with like wiring. This is how we get wired, right? And Porges says basically the theory of dissolution, dating back to 1910, the idea that we will always use the most recently learned defense system or the most recently developed defense system to survive. And we will start with social communication, social engagement. We all have a nervous system on the left side of our face, a bunch of nerves that are basically connected to the listening to the tone of voice, the look on a loved one's face to determine whether they're safe enough or not. And if they're safe, then we develop the ability to be relational. So what's a baby do when it needs to be changed or it's hungry? It cries. And then people either come to take care of them, safety, or they don't. And so if they don't, then what does a kid do? Cries more, and then harder, and then scream, and then do whatever it needs to do to get that person's attention to help them meet their needs. What if they have to do that every day, every time they have needs? Then they begin to, so think of Hebb's law, the neurons that fire together, wire together, and think of the process of pruning. Every baby is born with many, many, many thousand more neural connections than they will ever use in their life. And as they begin to experience and learn and develop, they prune the ones away that they don't use, and they hardwire the ones that they do use. And if I learn that the only way I'm going to get fed is to throw a fit, what do you think I'm wiring? Sympathetic nervous system response. And then if someone still doesn't feed me, then I begin to dissociate. And that's what this nervous system, the dorsal vagus nervous system, is about. It's all the internal organs. And so I want to show you a very brief video. And I want you to think about how quickly this process happens when you watch this. And I want you to think about what the guy says at the end of the video. So watch this baby and how fast this baby reacts to the mother's face.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yes.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Any reactions to that? Yes, that's in YouTube, yes. So there's a process called neuroception. And from the time that we're born, that process of kind of acculturation to the safety of the world, the tone of voice, the look on people's faces, are unconsciously read by each of us. Have you ever met a person and you immediately kind of felt a weird feeling and you didn't particularly feel very drawn to them and you have no idea why? Porges would say that's a process called neuroception, and that it has to do with there was something about the look on that person's face, the tone of their voice, that triggered something in our very early development that reacted to them. So do you think our clients do that with us? Absolutely. What do you think the client's reaction is? Oh, it would help if I turned it into this. What do you think of, these are the pictures that our children, our clients saw when they were children. Angry, exasperated, depressed. I love that picture. How often do kids see that? This kid crying. So I was amazed at how quick, that was the best example I've ever seen of how that child is biologically programmed and wired to connect to that person. So that was watching attachment in its basic practice. And so if that's what the client that we get, then we better pay attention to how the tone of voice of our staff, how angry our staff gets, how exasperated our staff gets, how connected to their I shouldn't say kipu, that's but their medical records and all of those other things. The trauma integrated work is attachment focused and very respectful and responsive to that. When I was at Cedar, we did a study for a couple years, and we began to look on our TSI scores of just what were the attachment scores of our clients. And when we looked at those, what we found, so the TSI gives us two levels. One is normal, then problematic, and then clinically significant. And when we looked at 374 men's TSIs, we found that 11% were avoidant at a problematic level, which basically means that they would be avoidant to a point where it would cause problems in their lives. And 12% of the men we treated were avoidant at a clinically significant level, which basically means they were going to struggle to connect to our staff on any level. And they're the ones who are most likely to go AMA, and they're the most likely to be the ones who engage in treatment until it gets hard and then disengage from treatment. 11% of the men were anxious problematic, and 18 were anxious clinically significant. And so we began at Cedar, and now we're doing the same thing at Foundry, to begin to look at, well, what are these attachment scores? This is what this guy's coming in with. How do we connect to someone who's going to be inherently difficult to connect with? And so one of the things we talk about is from the very first session, is this idea of, can you hang in here with me? Like, we're going to have really hard conversations, and I'm going to make you angry. How do we work through that? We make the covert overt almost immediately, talking about attachment and about struggles that we're going to have. On the women's side, 13% were avoidant, problematic, 16% avoidant, clinically significant. There's the real key, 24% anxious, problematic, and 21% anxious, clinically significant. And this just talks about that. And so that's why we put attachment on the foundation, that it's really the initial relationship. So one of the rules that we have is no drive-by introduction. And so the drive-by is, I'm going to a group, you're my new client, it's really nice to meet you, but I have this other stuff, but I'll probably see you like later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, but I just wanted to say hi, welcome to Foundry. But so what do you think that client immediately assumes by how busy I am? I'm not a high priority. And so that idea of everything from scripting the very first meeting with the client to make sure there's enough, even if you're not going to do the psychosocial at that point or whatever, but our thing is don't go in for less than 15 to 20 minutes where you can kind of hear their story a little bit. And so this is a big part of what we do. Time-wise, my belief is children don't have any concept of powerlessness or turn it over. And if you read Herman's book, she basically says, if the kids are programmed to believe that the big people in their lives are supposed to take care of them, and if the big people don't, then it must be me. And if it's me, then I will do my whole kind of attachment process, my whole coping strategy will be about trying to feel better. And constant experience of fear, anxiety, threat associated with being ourselves alters our brain and is the foundation for low self-esteem, anxiety, reactivity, dissociation, shame-based identity, trust, and attachment. And if we can understand that going in, we can begin the connection process in a very different way. Going to traumatic stress, what I love about the NARM model is that it is top-down and bottom-up. The key to trauma-integrated work, if you're really focusing on helping people get sober, is helping to keep their brain in place to be able to work with you and to remember the work that's being done. And so the idea of pendulating between bottom-down and top-up work. So one of the things I've experienced as a supervisor is that clinicians will often be working with a client on very core addiction issues that may be shame-based, very difficult issues. And when the person begins to get activated, they take them out of that work and begin to do bottom-up work with them, kind of mindful grounding, resourcing. But they don't go back in the same session to work, now that we've got you grounded, let's get back to what we need to get back to. And so that idea of, so one of the terms that they use in somatic experiencing and in this model is the term pendulate, to go from one to the other and back to the other. And so if you're really going to be a trauma integrated program, the level of sophistication of your therapists and being to recognize in the moment quickly autonomic nervous system activation, dissociation, and be able to work between those is going to be pretty critical. And so top down is cortical cognitive processing initiated with thoughts, allows talk therapy. Bottom up is subcortical limbic system processing, managing the autonomic nervous system response. And so there are very different interventions that we use to do both of those, and work very hard for our clinicians to know when to do which. Does that make sense, that idea of kind of going back and forth? And so I'll just be honest. I think that, so, you know, we do, like we have biosound and we're kind of doing a muse system to help people. And I hear a lot of people say, well, we have this kind of studio to do this work. And I think that's necessary but insufficient. The sufficient piece is doing that in the moment, keeping a person's prefrontal cortex. So what happens to the blood flow in our prefrontal cortex when we get anxious? It leaves. We're not going to remember any of the work that we did. It's just not going to happen. And so truly, trauma integrated work allows you to do both and allows you to really kind of work on that somatic. It's important for therapists to understand memory systems. And so the declarative memory system or explicit memory system. So if you are not currently dissociating, and I'm hoping you're not, you're probably in your declarative memory system. That if someone says to you, what did that guy talk about? You can say, well, you know, trauma or something like that. But you could say some of the things that I said because the blood flow to your prefrontal cortex is there. The autonomic response, the somatic response has been downregulated. You're listening, you're thinking, hopefully you're comparing it to the programs at home and ways to implement these things. This would be a great place for your brain to be in for talk therapy. But if you're dissociating, or if your kind of mind's wandering to what else could be going on, you're probably in your non-declarative memory system. That issue of, how many of you have ever been driving down a highway and been 2 exits past where you intended to turn on? No. Did you wreck your car? Probably not. Did you adjust your speed? You probably did. Did you change lanes? I'm going to bet you did. Did you stop texting? No, just kidding. But that idea of there are certain things that we do so much, and our networks are wired to such a degree that we do them without even thinking. The vast majority of our trauma response is that. And if we go back to how van der Kolk and others have looked at how trauma memories happen, that we don't actually, the Broca area of the brain that has to do with language is sound asleep. We don't remember the vast majority of what happened during that event. We remember mostly, so I'll just show you the other slide. So sensory information comes in from the outside, our sensory nerves, comes in through the thalamus, are assessed, that information gets sent to the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, in a non-threatening memory, processes it as being non-threatening, sends it to the hippocampus to begin to establish cognitive schemas. Eventually, that information is processed in the prefrontal cortex. Because our Broca area is not asleep during most memory, we have a narrative of what happened. We could tell the story of it without any problem. And so remember, if you don't have a narrative, you can't have a narrative memory. So if you're that scared, there's no way you have that narrative memory. And so if it is a trauma response, the amygdala responds to the threat, the hippocampus shuts down, the Broca area goes to sleep. So that process of creating schemas and moving that memory as a narrative event into the brain doesn't happen. What the brain remembers is all of this sensory information. And so the threat happens, we process it as an event, we have a somatic response, a body-based response, fight-flight response, and it becomes procedural, meaning we do it over and over. Every time we are reminded of it, we engage in the same behavior. And to the point where when we're sitting in a session with a client and we're talking about something that becomes really difficult and is experienced as a threat, they go into what's called event memory, meaning that they had the same sensory experience that they had during, like clients will say, well, I went into this like trauma response, but I wasn't even in an environment that was similar to the trauma. You don't have to be. All you have to do is experience some of the same sensory and emotional responses that you had during that event. So I could be working on step 1 with you and tell you the story of something that I did that was highly embarrassing, highly shameful, highly fearful, and go into a proceduralized response that's a trauma response. And so that idea of, if that's the case, we have to bring that person through a bottom-up process back to a point where they can talk about it. And then they can begin to process their addiction. But if we just move them over to the resourcing and don't move back to, let's go back to the step 1, where are they going to get that? So that's why they're here. So that's really the kind of the foundation of what we're trying to say, is the idea of pendulating between the two. This is a model that a friend of mine developed, and the idea of helping clients begin to understand how a certain threat activates the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. I have a copy of that in my office. My clients, one of the things I tell them, it is important to learn how to move your marbles and not lose your marbles. And the idea of those are marbles, and during times of stress, they get to the point where they can begin to recognize, I'm feeling more and more stressed. My marbles are moving rather than I'm losing them. And that idea of what do you need to do to go from here to here? And so the idea that most of the time, our clients live right here, but they feel relaxed, but they wouldn't know the difference. And so how hard is it to go from here to being overwhelmed, like I say to clients, how many of you get angry really fast? Boy, these hands go up. And it's because they think that this is normal, or they think this is relaxed, when in reality, their nervous system is so overwhelmed all the time that they go from being highly stressed to dissociative. So dual activation basically means that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are activated at the same time, and that the person's just sitting there waiting to see if they can relax or if they have to fight. Relax or they have to fight. And you've probably seen clients in your office that you got that sense where they're just waiting to see where this is going to go. And that's that dual activated state. And so we want to make the covert overt with that. So I just developed this the other day, and it's going to be the new poster in my office. So how many people do SUDS scales? So in my mind, a SUD scale is a really good measure of sympathetic response. Doesn't do much for parasympathetic, meaning I can be dissociated and feel pretty darn low on the SUD scale. That's not very helpful to me as a therapist. And so I have a 3-part process that I go through with my clients, and particularly early in the process. We start with the autonomic nervous system measure. Where are they? Where are their marbles today? And if they're in the sympathetic nervous system realm, then I will ask them to use the SUD scale. And so if they're a 6, then I will say to them, what are you thinking? What are you feeling emotionally? What are you thinking, experiencing, not thinking in your body, experiencing in your body? And what is your impulse? And how would that be different if you were a 4 rather than a 6? And the idea is really beginning to allow clients to begin to say, I'm stressed, and to be able to give them a way to understand that they can talk about it, experience it, and begin to develop their own coping mechanisms to begin to reduce that. And so These 4 questions came out of, I'm a marriage counselor by training, and I would see these 2, and you just know they were getting ready to have this big fight. And like I started saying, well, do you want to have the fight? Like, let's go for it, or do you want to not have the fight? Because I'd rather we not have the fight. So what I would ask them each, I have another picture, another poster in my office that's just these, and really get the person to begin to say, well, when he says this, I think this. And then I feel this in my body, and I can feel my chest tightening. And we begin to get them to recognize this kind of very integral somatic play that's going on. And then we get to the impulse. I want to end the session. I want to have an argument with you. Like, I think how many clients have like challenged you, and they get to the point where they can't tolerate it anymore. And again, if you could titrate or go in smaller steps along the way, or pendulate out of that for a few minutes so that they can calm down and then have that discussion in a different way. So I guess long story short, trauma-enhanced therapy is we're going to do the addiction work we always do, but we're going to have this sort of therapist who does something special like EMDR to kind of do some tools and you know, when they're ready to do it. We are of the opinion that there's lots of things we can do with EMDR from the day the person gets there, focused on the addiction and focus on helping them be sober. And it really then, when it's time to start working on the traumas, they've already experienced EMDR. It's not going to be this big freak out of like, oh my gosh, I'm trying this new technique. And it's like, oh yeah, so we're just going to take it and add another piece to that. And so that's really, in my mind, how that works. And so the model that we've developed, actually, well, okay, 10 minutes, or 5 minutes. So if I was going to say the pendulation process, this is what it looks like. These are the recovery milestones that we focus on: commitment to abstinence, connect life consequences to their chemical use, identity, family. And these are the NARM principles that have been established. And our job is to make sure that we allow them to get this before they're ready to leave, and that we've kind of helped them with issues of aliveness, living. We do a lot of wellness, a lot of things to make them kind of experience life as what it's going to look like to be sober, but also to work on connection, attunement, and those other issues.